Wow.
Too exciting.
Wow, Ezra Nehemiah is going to be a little less exciting compared to that story. I don't know, return after an exile. Whoa, that's exciting. Her plane was in Okay, that's really
Good morning. My
Thank
name
God.
is Brenda.
Good morning,
I'm glad
Brenda.
to see you.
Welcome.
Thank
Okay,
you.
I'm switching screens just to see if I see any other faces. I said anyone who's just clicking in now, everyone asks that videos remain off and on mute just for quality, just for the sake of quality. But if anyone just takes their videos off for 1 sec, so I could just see friendly faces, see who's here, get a sense of who's in the class. Okay.
It's so good to be with you again.
Oh, thank you. It's good to see you guys. I missed it. My soul needs this. Okay.
What you do?
And now I need to minimize you all. I'm sorry. And I'm going to...
Everybody should mute themselves.
Yeah, I'm going to remind everyone to mute themselves. But here's the little qualifier to that statement. Please, at any point, if you have questions, if you have comments, in the past, we're going to do a little trial and error. In the past, people have asked that because, Zoom is such a different format and it's sort of hard to stay focused when you have a video and you're not sitting in a classroom with other people. So people in the past have mentioned that it's harder to stay focused when there's a lot of questions in the middle of class, and they prefer actually that we save all questions until the end of class. I'm happy to go with that model, to continue with that model. That's what we sort of did in the springtime, and I think it worked nicely. But please feel free. If you have questions, if you have suggestions, if you'd rather have questions during class, email me on the side. We'll try, again, it's going to be a lot of trial and error, a lot of trying to figure out. Some of it will depend on class size. Some of it will depend on, I don't know, quality of internet and things as profound as that. So we're going to start, but definitely if I say take yourselves off mute and answer, then please, because I crave the interaction and I really, really miss it. So I try every once in a while to throw questions out that'll get you thinking and that it's a little more interactive. For those of you who have been in my classes live, you know that lecturing is not my favorite part of the
lecture.
I love the back and forth. So we're going to do our best to try to find the balance. And again, do not hesitate at all to email me after. A lot of times, if you send those messages on the Zoom, I actually am not usually able to answer those while I'm teaching. And then as soon as we leave the meeting, they disappear. So my emails are available through the Matan office if you don't have it already. And, by all means, email. But I will always leave questions at the end of class.
You'll have to look at
the end of class as well. So here we go. Just gonna pin it. Okay. And I'll be also one other, just by way of intro, I'll be putting up all the screens, the share screens that I have. But I will also be sending them ahead of time to the office. So for those of you that prefer to have a hard copy, if it's hard to follow it on the screen, then I will always send a copy to the office ahead of time, and you'll be able to print it out a day or two in advance, if that's what you prefer as well. Okay. All right, so we're going to begin. And what I wanted to do today, actually, for those of you who have been in my classes before, you know that we are heavily textual. We are always looking inside the text. We're always reading the text. We're carefully mining it for ideas and for what the author himself is herself is trying to convey to us through the text itself. But Ezra Nehemiah, which is going to be really the focus of this course, is very unique in a lot of ways. And I think it sort of deserves an introduction that's a little, not necessarily lengthier, but a little sort of extra outside of the text than we normally do. And that's because Ezra Nehemiah really is one of the first Svarim that's dealing in Tanakh with the topic of exile in retrospect. Most of the Svarim that we're used to learning in the narrative portions of Tanakh, we read Shmuel and we read Melachim and we read, are all written leading up to the exile. Exile is always looming. Exile is always hovering. It's always sort of this threat. If you don't follow the rules, if you don't keep a covenant and maintain, the strictures of God, then you will end up outside of the land. Ezra Nehemiah. And by the way, for anyone who doesn't understand, is not familiar with the time, with the context, with the, again, historical, political, we're going to be doing all of that in the coming weeks. I'm going to be giving you all the nitty gritty of the Persian Empire and what was happening to the Jews within the Persian Empire, how they were able to go back. But what I want to talk about today really is a little bit more sort of conceptual, and talk about exile really as a concept. Okay. And I think that when I say exile, well, here we go. I'm going to ask you, take your themselves off mute for 2 seconds. When I ask you to think about the word exile and its sort of counterpart, restoration, right? Because the two come hand in hand. Exile only exists as a concept because there's a concept of center, right? So when I say the words to you, exile and restoration, what do you think of? What words come to mind?
Banishment.
Okay, excellent. Punishment. And that's really important that that's your first thought. We're going to talk about that, okay? That's part of a philosophy that Tanakh has outlined and that we've internalized. Beautiful. What else?
Loss.
Excellent. Loss of what, for example? And we're going to talk about this in the next 2 weeks.
Home.
Okay, home. What else?
Holiness.
Identity. Identity.
Excellent. Holiness, identity. Give me more words. What else?
Sovereignty.
Hester Panim.
Hester Panim. Beautiful. Okay. And by the way, all the things that we're talking about, and this is something that we try to be sort of aware of, right, in a self-reflective way, all the concepts that we're talking about, or at least everyone that I've heard so far, are all concepts that Tanakh has developed for us, right? When we say the word Hester Panim, that's a concept that Yecheskel Hanavi sort of devised as a means through which we talk about what gets lost in exile. Okay, so that's one of the things we're going to be tracing is all these ideas that everyone's free associating. Where do they come from? Where are the roots of those ideas that now to us it's second nature? All right, any other thoughts?
Assimilation, acculturation.
Okay, assimilation, acculturation, right? The impact of exile, the impact of, as we're going to see, diaspora. Anything else? Any other words?
Loss of sovereignty.
Okay, sovereignty is huge, right? To be able to determine your own destiny, to be able to decide the laws that the people within the land need to follow, or outside of the land, right? If I'm outside, then I need to follow the laws of the land. If I'm back inside, as we're going to see, that's going to be a big issue in Ezra Nehemiah. Whose laws am I following? Okay, so exile and restoration really are two interrelated concepts. And they pertain to this, they're sort of contrastive concepts, but they really are what pertain to this topic when we talk about Galut and Gula. I'm gonna be super obnoxious and tell everyone to remute yourselves now, just because the background noises disrupts people. Thanks. And actually, Shmaryahu Talmon, who speaks a lot about this as sort of a phenomenon, talks about exile and restoration as almost a movement and a counter movement. Right. And so it's really, really important when we're thinking about the concept. And before we start looking at how it's addressed in Ezra Nehemiah, that we sort of take a step back and look at the concept more broadly, because I think, one of the things that we're going to be looking at is how do Ezra Nehemiah deal with the concept of exile? How do they deal with the concept of diaspora? How do they deal with the idea of return? What does it mean to rebuild? But we can only understand Ezra Nehemiah's unique voice. And again, those of you who have been in my classes know that one of the things we're always looking for is the unique voice of the author of this sefer, right? And in order to do that, we want to sort of take a step back and understand what exile means more broadly. And again, just by point of contrast, Megillat Esther, for example, will have a very different take on the concept of exile than Ezra Nehemiah. And the two of them will have very different takes, for example, than Sefer Daniel. Okay, so we're always going to be looking sort of for as objectively as possible for what a topic is speaking of. And then we're going to look more specifically at what the author of the sefer we're looking at. Now, when we're talking about exile and restoration, there's really two components that we also need to sort of be self-aware of. Even though it's a course in Tanakh, we're always going to sort of be self-critical. On the one hand, we have the universal component. Okay, the idea that exile is really part of the human experience, and that throughout the world and throughout time, peoples have been exiled from their lands. But the other thing, and we're going to be seeing this, is that there are specific theological ramifications, and some of you guys threw them out, right? You were free associating, and without even realizing it, you had very specific religious and theological ramifications that are involved when we speak about exile and restoration from the perspective of Tanakh. And those concepts really add another dimension to the conversation that may or may not be part of the universal experience. Okay, so we're going to start to begin with the universal. Okay, the term exile, and if anyone does not have their Tanakh on them, we're not going to be doing a lot inside, but I'm just going to be looking at a couple of psukim sprinkled here and there. So just grab a Tanakh if you don't have one yet. The term exile, okay, in its most simple, basic, and again, we're sort of stepping back from Tanakh for a little bit. The concept of exile denotes the forced removal of individuals or groups, right, of people from their homeland. Okay. Now we know that in Hebrew, the word gola or galut is actually, does anyone know what the word originally means in Tanakh, the word the galot? And I'll give you a hint. You can look in Yecheskel, Perek Yud Bet, Ezekiel chapter 12. And there he uses the word in its most sort of basic, or we might say original form. Yecheskel Yud Bet, it's Ezekiel chapter 12. Yecheskel comes right after Yirmiyahu, and it's verse 3. And Yecheskel says, okay, I'm reading inside. Ve'ata ben adam aseh lecha klei gola uglei yomam le'ineihem ve'galita mimakomcha el makom acher le'ineihem ulai yir'u ki beit mari hema. Okay, he's talking here about yourself. The Navi is saying, right, prepare yourselves to go into exile, but he's speaking here about being removed, being stripped from your land and ending up in another place entirely, right? And he's saying, V'hotzeta, Pasuk Daled, verse 4, V'hotzeta chelecha kichlei gola, yomam le'ineihem. He's saying, and bring whatever you can with you, because gear up, you're going to be out. You're not going to be able to be in this place that you know and you're familiar with, okay? So the implication really is that gola, or exile, right? It doesn't just describe the body of expatriates who have been forced to leave their homeland, okay? It also alludes to the land that was stripped of its inhabitants. And for those of you, again, I'm going to be, as I reference things that we've done in previous courses, I'll just give like a sort of a quick glimpse. We talk a lot about Tanakh, in Tanakh, of the land as being dynamic. The land is not something that's static. The land is not just something we step on or we build houses on. The land in Tanakh is oftentimes anthropomorphized or used as a metaphor for something dynamic and something living. And so in Tanakh, one of the things that we look at is that there are two components to exile. There's the concept of the people that leave, and there's the concept also of the land being left devoid of people. Okay, now deportation can be, okay, or more often than not, if we're talking about people being deported, is violent, and it severs the natural bonds of the exiled with their land, right? And the bonds manifest in lots and lots of ways. We have physical bonds. We have, right, bonds, meaning if you have gravestones that you visit in a place, you can no longer have access to your past. There are emotional ties, there are cultural ties. And so when people are exiled, it doesn't just rip them from what they know, it forces them to transfer to this gaping unknown, to this void. Okay, and generally with the loss of landscape, displaced people are prone to be deprived of values of their mother tongue, right? Most of the people on this group are I imagine, olim or olot, chadashot relatively, right? I guess you're in Olaf forever. So you're stripped of your mother tongue, you're stripped of time-honored manners and customs. And the truth is, Aliyah is not even really a great parallel, because Aliyah, we're returning on some level to our customs, to our heritage. But you take, right, look at the Syrian refugees that are now ending up in all parts of the world. They're cut off from everything they know, okay? And so again, while we're going to be looking at the national impact of exile, we always have to remember that for every group of exiles, there's always that personal experience. And one of the things that's going to be amazing is that within Ezra Nehemiah, we're going to see traces of those personal experiences addressed. Okay, so you have the personal, and then you have the cumulative effect of that trauma, of what makes up, and that the cumulative effect is what's going to make up that national experience that we're going to be looking at. Okay, now usually, and this is the case also with the exile we're going to be looking at, usually exile occurs in the wake of some sort of upheaval, in the wake of a war or a defeat, right? And in the ancient world, it was actually more common than it is now. We know, for example, the Aseret HaShvatim, the Assyrians came in, and when they defeated the northern kingdom, they exiled the northern tribes from the land, and they dispersed them, okay? So people end up being displaced. And then also there's usually what follows is that once you're dispersed, once you're displaced, you're usually dispersed as well. Okay, people start to move out, people start to spread, people start to sort of lose that cohesion. And so whereas in the past, a group of people might have had, and again, a lot of stuff I'm talking about the universal experience, but if anyone is familiar with Ezra Nehemiah, we're going to see all of these issues are going to come into play, where in the past you have this sort of cohesion. You have a societal cohesion, you have a common history, you have a common geography that binds you. All of a sudden, the people that lived in that place are displaced and dispersed. Okay, and that's really the concept of diaspora that we talk about. It's a life, right, that's fragmented. right? It's a life where you're dependent on another place, where you're marginalized from that dominant society, you're immigrants, right? And it's a society that's prone to sort of maintaining this ambivalent stance vis-a-vis outsiders, right? No natives are ever fully open to outsiders. The question of how many generations it takes for outsiders to become insiders is a separate question, but no country, right, as PC as we might want to be, is ever really open fully. And we're going to have to talk about this because it's going to come up a lot, right? Why do we have that ambivalent or sort of inimical stance vis-a-vis others with the capital O? We're going to be looking at that in a sort of a very open and honest way. But that's something that's very, very profoundly felt by the outsiders and also by the insiders as people move in, okay? Now, in the short term, you tell me what happens, okay? Someone take your things off mute if you have answers. In the short term, okay, a group is exiled from their country. It's not necessarily, and we're going to see sometimes it is, but if we're talking about a forced deportation, so what happens when the people get to that new country?
Stay together.
Okay,
They group
initially,
together.
okay, excellent, right? And initially, and I'm going to use the word ghetto without any, any of the associations we have from World War II, but initially, right, there's sort of this ghetto experience. What does that mean? What does that entail? What is a ghetto? Why do we have?
Holding on to traditions, to
okay,
all the things
Same
that
language.
they've known
okay.
before the pressure of integration and dispersion.
Correct, right? And it's interesting that you use the word pressure, right, of integration. But for the most part, right, we have this ghetto scenario, which arises, like you're saying, from the sort of twofold. One is the imposed separation of the exiles from surrounding society, which we mentioned, right? It's not often that the right, am echad mifuzaro miforad, well, whose decision was that, right? So on the one hand, you have people separated from the main society, but oftentimes, as someone just mentioned, right, we can also have this self-imposed segregation, which is really reflective of the diaspora community trying to cling to its particular identity, right? And it sort of develops into this defensive posture vis-a-vis the immediate environment. Someone mentioned the pressure to integrate, the pressure, right, to sort of become like your host or like your native country. And the initial wave of immigrants tried to create this ghetto to protect that, to protect what they're more familiar with. Okay. Now, yes, please.
Can I?
Sure, please,
we have
please.
another aspect of not knowing the language, not being familiar with the food, not being familiar with the weather. The clothing is different. As exiles, we look different. We look to the other people. And you talk about the ghetto experience, it's because of all these strange phenomena. And it doesn't, and we know from our own history, from World War II, when people came over, second generation, third generation. And then people may be taking different jobs, not doing the same work.
Correct.
So that's everything we're talking about, Kaveri. It's not necessary to mention.
Right. 100%, I think. And again, we don't even have to personalize it to the Jewish experience, but you're 100% right. All of those things that make you different, right? So again, whether it's the native people trying to keep you separate or the people, the immigrants themselves trying to stay separate, that's gonna come down to the specifics of any given scenario. But you always have that initial phase of ghettoization to a degree, okay? Now, and again, like you mentioned beautifully, right? We have different names, we have different beliefs, we have different lifestyles, right? Clothing, tastes, things as simple as food or odors, right? Spices in different countries. All of these things that seem to be sort of frivolous or extraneous are important because they sort of, they're elements in a new surrounding that immigrants or expatriates need to get rid of, need to get used to, okay? Now, by the way, it's very, very interesting. If you think about the Midrash, right? It's actually the Midrash that became famous because of Uncle Moshe, right? So I don't remember the famous Uncle Moshe song about the Bnei Israel in Mitzrayim, what the Midrash talks about, what did they keep, right? I have a name, I have a lovely Jewish name, and it talks about how Bnei Israel in Egypt, in Mitzrayim, kept their name, right? And anyone remember? Any Uncle Moshe experts?
Their language and their clothing.
Okay, excellent, right? And again, if we think about that and what the Midrash is really reflecting are those sort of trappings or those externals, right? Your name, your clothing, your language, that over time eventually integrate. Eventually you become the native, but initially that's what distinguishes you. Initially, that's what keeps you separate. I don't know if anyone's read The Man in the White Sharkskin Suit. It's an excellent, excellent, sort of I don't know if it's autobiography, memoir really, that sort of talks about this process of integration and how the parents who try to maintain that ghetto existence, how the second generation wants to integrate, and the push and the pull and sort of the tension that exists between those relationships. What's interesting, and we're going to look at, is that we weren't in Bavel for that long. Right? The Jews were in Bavel for 70 years. That's a generation and a half. And so the people that were coming back, how integrated were they into Bavel? How much did they remember about their native rules? All of that's going to come into play when we talk about the return. Now, there is also when exile can't be fought. Okay, when you can't remain in a ghetto forever, or when there's too much pushback from the second generation and the third generation. So then what happens is there's a degree of resignation on the part of the exiles, right? There's a degree of sort of accepting or submitting to those external pressures and adjusting to the new reality, both individually and collectively. Okay, and again, what we might call a healthy model. And we certainly see evidence of Jews assuming this approach to sort of give up on internal resistance and to transform the negative characteristic of dispersion into a positive aspect of a structured community, right? Existence within the diaspora, okay? But here's the important part, and here's what's going to be really, really important. The key word here when we talk about the diaspora, well, actually, you tell me, here we go. If I asked you, okay, what maintains a diaspora experience as a diaspora experience, meaning what prevents people from being exiled or from expatriates ever fully integrating and embracing and becoming one with the land they moved to? What is it? If you had to guess. Huh?
A strong connection to the original homeland.
Okay, excellent. A strong connection. I'm going to say there's another word that's even sort of more on point, that it encompasses a strong connection. What else?
I was thinking religion.
Religion.
Okay, so religion, yes, although religion is transportable, right?
Memory.
Yeah, but it keeps it keeps you with your people like yourself. If you need to, you need a house of worship. You need
okay, so excellent. Okay, religion keeps us connected to the group to which we belong. We're talking about something else. We're talking about connection to land, and that's really, really important for us to be able to distinguish.
I think after generations, the land disappears. The land as such, the Israel.
Never.
We talk about, wait a minute, you talk about Lashana Haba, Yerushalayim at Pesach, but when you're already a United States citizen, or you're a British citizen, or you come from Europe and you've been there generations, it's not the same connection as the people who were coming out from Israel at that time and going to Babylon. It's just not the same connection.
I'm not quite sure because if you think about the Palestinian, and I know we don't like to think about it, but we do have.
Okay.
If you think, wait a minute, if you think about, when I think about my growing up in France, in part of my family not Jewish, their connection to the part of France that they were coming from, and the connection to France was extraordinarily strong and is still extraordinarily strong. In other words, generation after generation, they went in workplaces, but they always come back at the end of their life where their family came from. And their attitude, a literary example of this.
So I agree with you. I think, but the question is, how many generations can that nationalism hold for? So I want to throw out a word that I think is important for us to bear in mind. And I think once we understand this word, and once we realize how central it was to the Jewish experience throughout the exile, we'll understand that the word, really, as simple as it sounds, is hope. Okay? As long as diaspora life, meaning as long as the displaced experience is perceived as something that is enforced, okay, that the expatriates can't change because they have no choice, then the hope of a return to the homeland is kept alive, right? And there's an implicit demand or an assumption upon the exiles that as soon as they're able, they will. And their return can be attainable through a change of the previously adverse political situation, right? When a new king arises, then maybe we'll be able to go back. Or when, again, if there's a war and there's a new power in the region, then maybe we'll be able to go back. And then what happens is that every individual is essentially, when that happens, called upon to take hold of that moment, right? To actively intervene in the course of history, and by his or her return to sort of further the restoration of what was undone in that previous war, in that previous scenario. Okay. Now, one of the
yeah. But I mean that you said you say as long as there's that hope of return through the generations, the hope, and if the Shilton changes, then maybe they can go back. That is true. I guess that's true maybe for some people, but for instance, for American Jews that
okay, back up. We're going to have plenty of opportunities to sort of create the parallels, and it goes without saying, right, that Ezra Nehemiah is right, sort of eerily similar to what we're looking at today. But I don't want to look now at American Jewry and compare and contrast and what happened to the Jews after 48. I imagine, meaning everything you're about to say, I imagine I will agree with. Now we're just looking, again, sort of objectively at scholars who have studied, not from the perspective of Tanakh, but the concept of exile universally. Okay, there's plenty of stuff that's going to hit nerves, that goes without saying, but we're going to skip over those for now, and let's just talk conceptually. Okay, it's one of the sort of things that scholars and historians have noted is that when there's voluntary migration, okay, versus involuntary migration. Involuntary migration means the people have no choice. They were exiled, they are stuck in the land, and nothing they can do will change that reality. Okay, and what happens when the experience is that, whether it's true or not, okay, whether it's true or not, the perceived reality that they cannot change, the reality of diaspora, it engenders this sense of hope, that they can hope to one day be able to control their own fate and their own destiny. And the assumption is that when that happens, they will do that. Okay, again, we know that narratives and perceptions are not necessarily always reflective of the entirety of a reality, but that's the model of involuntary migration. From the other side, okay, we have voluntary migration. Okay,
Yael, sorry, can I ask? Surely rejection plays a part in that as well. If you're rejected often enough, you long to go back.
That's interesting. If you're rejected, so again, it's sort of, I wonder, I don't know enough. And again, I'm making really, really, really blanket statements about this, topic. I'm wondering, again, is it chicken or the egg? Is it that the immigrants aren't, inculcating into society in the way that's, that could sort of erase the differences between them. And so society always sees them as outsiders. And so they feel the rejection. And again, we're not bringing anti-Semitism into this topic because it's a whole different topic. Is it that, they're holding on to the hope and that's why they don't want to integrate? I don't know. It's a really important question, Leslie. I'm not sure. And again, I don't think there's one answer. I think with any given exilic experience where, there's so many factors that come into play. But what scholars have sort of drawn the line between is the perceived involuntary versus voluntary migration. If it's involuntary, again, the assumption is that there's this hope that's going to be held on to, that they don't want to be there and they want to go back to their native country, as opposed to, right, voluntary migration. Right, which is not what we're going to be talking about in Ezra Nehemiah, but it's other reasons that people might leave their native land. You have drought, you have famine, you have economic hardships, you have entrepreneurial interests, right? How many Israelis are moving to San Francisco? You have religious schisms. There's, desire for adventure. There's all these different reasons that would compel a person or a group really with a specific ethnic collective to emigrate and relocate in a new country. Okay, but when voluntary migration happens, the resettlement of the deportees in their new environment, in their new space, may bring about the establishment of sort of these semi-independent enclaves. Okay, and so again, you have this sort of diaspora communities that are there voluntarily, so they have distinct social and political entities, and they can achieve a new standing and provide a sense of security that mitigates the exile's feelings of being strangers in their foreign abode. There isn't that same antagonism that comes with being forced to go to a country, whereas I'm choosing to go there because there's a great startup that I want to get involved in, and I'm going to join the local shul, and I'm going to build a mikvah, and whatever the case may be. Okay. The difference, though, and this is, again, we're not getting personal and we're not getting Jewish or Israeli, but we're just saying what happens as time passes is that this development is bound to lead to a weakening of their historical and emotional bonds with their homelands. It's saying nothing about their degree of religion, okay? It's about the connection to the homeland, okay, itself. And one of the things that we're sort of going to be looking at, or we're going to be, the different experiences that we're going to be talking about, is that when forced exiles see life in a strange land and among foreign people is spelling alienation from the familiar and from what they're used to, when it's a choice, it can be associated with broadening of intellectual horizons, of being receptive to novel beliefs and ideas. Okay, the former life in one's native land, sometimes after a while, also starts to feel, limiting and restricting and stifling. And so when we talk about diaspora, one of the things that we're going to be keeping in mind, and it's important because when we're going to be talking about Ezra Nehemiah, the question that we're going to be looking at is the people that are in the land in the days of Ezra Nehemiah. Is that considered a forced, or is that considered a voluntary migration? Right? They were forced initially, but now the land is open up. So if they're still there, is that by choice, or is that because they have no choice? And that's going to sort of call all of these concepts into question, right? The Jews initially, there's no question, they were initially forced to go out to Babel. But then Cyrus is going to write a decree in the first chapter of Ezra Nehemiah. And then the question is, well, what happens to the Jews that are left there? And then the question is going to be even sharpened when you have a second wave of returnees returning about 100 years after the Cyrus decree. What are they coming with? What baggage are they bringing with them, right? Not just literal baggage, right? But what kind of emotional, religious, social baggage are they bringing back with them in that second wave? And how is that going to change the reality inside the land? Okay, so all of these are questions that we're going to be looking at. Now, as long as the community, actually, you know what? I'm just looking at the time. Yeah, we have time. Okay. As long as the community essentially feels that it's being forced upon them, okay, and this is a really, really interesting distinction, then the hope of return to the homeland is kept alive. And there's an understanding that as soon as the exiles can go back, they will. Okay. The assumption is that the return could be attainable through a change and how they can undo everything that happened. Okay. And when that happens, everyone is going to go back. The same assumptions don't hold for a voluntary diaspora. And we're going to be looking at those two cases when we look inside Ezra Nehemiah. Now, I'm going to give 30 seconds for, I know people are messaging me that we're going to sort of try to minimize comments and questions throughout the class. We're going to leave a couple of minutes at the end, but just free associate for 2 seconds. If I asked you how, or even just begin to think of this question, okay? How is the Tanakh, we've been talking here, right, about the universal and the unique, and we've been looking really at the universal experience of exile. The question is, how does the Tanakh, or what is different when we speak about exile within Tanakh? Okay, so again, throw out just one word, even free associate, one word answers. How would the experience as it's shaped in Tanakh? And again, some of you already were thinking along these lines without realizing it initially when I posed the question about exile itself.
Punishment.
Okay, so excellent. It's understood in the context of reward and punishment.
Persecution.
Okay, excellent, right? It's also sort of the enemy. The enemy becomes a very big, oh, that's someone's airplane taking off. Okay. We have, right?
God.
Okay.
God.
Excellent. Okay, God comes into play, right? It's not just about, right, the lands and the enemies. One of the things that's going to be so important is the theological component of it all. There's something pulling the strings. It's not just that the Babylonians are going to be strong and we're going to be weak. Someone up there is going to give the Babylonians the power, and someone there is going to let us be exiled. And so sociologically, historically, conceptually, the Jewish experience belongs in the universal framework, but at the same time, Israel never saw exile and restoration as just or exclusively determined by political or economic circumstances, okay? Rather, a cycle was always seen as this sort of in a metaphysical context, Okay, deportations, when we talk about Bavel taking us out, was given a deeper meaning by the interpretation of the events as, and so many of you use this word, as punishment for transgressions of the individual and of the collective. Okay, so this new level of meaning is added to the concept in Tanakh, specifically because, right, Tanakh conceives of Hashem as revealing himself to us through the cycle of exile and restoration. Okay.
And also, I think,
yeah.
I'm sorry. Also in Tanakh, we get the feeling the land itself is suffering when we're not there. Correct. Like when you say metaphysical, the land lies fallow if the Jews aren't living there.
Correct. There's a
That's
very
unique to Jewish people.
100%. And we're going to talk about that, right? Even the concept of exile is understood as right, it lies fallow, but it's also experienced as a Shabbat for the land, right? The land finally got a rest from all of us because we were, filling it up with all sorts of impurities and abominable behavior. So it's almost it was almost like God had mercy on the land and kicked us out, right? It's called the Shemitah. It was the Yovel for the land, or the Shemitah for the land. So you're 100% correct. There's that dynamic that's looked at. Right, the land as this again, not living, but as a reactive phenomenon, so to speak. So, but in terms of that deportation,
yeah,
right,
is there also something about?
Yeah,
I was just saying, there's also something about the idea of how long we're going to be there. In other words, like when we left originally, Yirmiyahu told the people that unpack your bags. This is going to be a long haul.
So hold that question. We're going to look at that parak from Yirmiyahu in the beginning, because it's a really, that parak that you're referring to, parak Chavtet in Yirmiyahu, is sort of a very critical parak to understanding how we even wrapped our heads around exile, right? It was always looming, it was always a threat, but then once staring you in the face, how you deal with it, right? Sort of really essentially like how you react to the actual tangible components is something that we're going to have to look at. So excellent, hold that question. The danger with dispersion, okay, and this is also something that we're going to be talking about, and something that Ezra and Nehemiah are going to have to work against, okay, is that the danger with dispersion is always that the people being dispersed are going to lose contact with the center, okay, and in Tanakh, the land is inextricably linked to our faith and our nationhood, okay? Abraham, we're about, perfect timing, Lech Lecha next week, okay? Abraham is told in order for the promises to manifest, he will have to be in the land and his children will have to first get back to the land. So exile in Tanakh doesn't just disrupt the unity of family and the unity of community. It tears apart the bond of the people that are deported with the land. Okay, and in doing so, and we're gonna, again, I'm sort of dropping a lot of overarching ideas that we're gonna have to get into the details of, but in doing so, it also dissolves the solidarity of God with his people, because primarily we connect to God through the temple and through Har HaMoriah and through Yerushalayim and through sacrifices, okay? So in theory, right, the suffering can only be healed by a return to the land, okay? Now, it seems when you have a diaspora, okay, it's great. I was just as like perfect when you're preparing a course and then something in real life happens to remind you of it. I took my kids to the park the other day, because where else do we go? And there was this big metal thing that spins around, but it's not the kind where the kids can hold on and not actually fall off head first. It was built in Israel. So it's just a big slab of metal that spins really fast. And then I used it as a lesson for my kids. I said, you see that? That's centrifugal force as they went flying off the metal, because the more you spin it, right? So it exerts this sort of force that shoves them outward, that pushes them away. Okay. I think if we think of exile, if we think of the dispersion of people as that centrifugal force, as the pulling away from the center, so then one of the challenges of leaders, and we're going to see particularly with Ezra Nehemiah, is to try to figure out how to reignite that centripetal force, how to make sure you don't even have to imagine it as forces, imagine it of magnets, right? If you have a big magnet in the center, that's the temple, that's Yerushalayim, that's the Beit HaMikdash, that's sacrifices. So the question is, if the magnets are moving further and further away, how do you make sure that magnet in the center gets bigger and stronger so that it doesn't lose its pull on the magnets that are slipping further and further away? Because as we all know with magnets, right, once it hits that critical distance, it's no longer going to have any pull at all. Okay, that's going to be the job of Ezra Nehemiah. Okay, to be able to maintain that centripetal pull. Okay, now I'll add one other thing, and then I want to look at the handouts that I uploaded for today. But one of the things that's really, really fascinating, and scholars have noticed that when we focus, when the focus, right, or the bond between the people and the land becomes one of Acharit Hayamim, when we stop talking about the land as something we have to return to today, and when we start talking about it as something that's going to happen in Acharit Hayamim, in the end of days, right, when it becomes mixed up with eschatology, then our relationship to the land becomes spiritual, it becomes metaphysical, it becomes theoretical, rather than a historical, physical bond to the land itself. Okay, and that's something that we're going to be looking at as well. In the days of Ezra Nehemiah, one of the things that the leaders needed to do was maintain this very tangible connection to the physical land and not let it become this metaphysical idea or this metaphysical concept that becomes religious and spiritual, but not practical. Okay.
Can I ask you something? Sorry, could I just ask you that?
Sure.
You talked about tikva before, and you quoted Jeremiah, this whole question of going into exile. Then how do you explain, or how would you bring in that you get the contrary idea that they always talk about you coming back to the land? You've got that both in Yeshaya, you've got it in all the prophets, so why am I, that there's always the corollary that yes, you will go into exile, you'll suffer from all this, but you are going to come back. You are going to come back. Now, how does that fit into the way people will think, or the whole idea of belief, and etc., etc.?
Listen, I think that's exactly it, right? I think, meaning exactly what we were saying before. We said that one of the things that distinguishes the sort of the ability to maintain that connection, if we're talking about that centripetal force, right? So one of the things that enables us, or you know, again, the collective to maintain that connection is the concept of hope. The hope that I can return is what keeps me connected. The hope that it's imminent is what keeps me connected. And again, if we think about it, one of the things that Tanakh almost implanted in the concept of exile itself is the cycle of exile and return, right? Meaning it's not just exile in a vacuum, it's a cycle. If there's exile, there will be return, right? No Navi spoke of exile in all of Tanakh without also having nechama.
Yeah.
Okay, so that cycle is something that's so critical when we understand the sort of psychological impact of that, right? I think. But actually, if you hold that question, if I didn't answer it fully, we're gonna look at one thing in 2 minutes that I think might also sort of help us make sense of it. Now, it goes without saying, just one last thing, just by way of introduction, that over this course, we're going to be looking primarily at Ezra Nehemiah, but again, in order to understand how Ezra Nehemiah perceives the exile and kingship and temple and prophecy and all the other things that's going to have to deal with, we're going to be looking also at other relatively contemporaneous works, mostly, right, Divrei Hayamim, and also a little bit of Chagai Zechariah, which are the last of the Nevi'im that prophesies in the early phases of the restoration period. And so we're going to be looking at sort of Ezra Nehemiah in context vis-a-vis the other voices that were prominent during that period, or in the early phases of the period. Okay. Now, I'm going to share a screen now very quickly. For those of you that have been in my classes before, you might be very familiar with this idea. I might even have, for all I know, I have zero memory these days. I have quarantine brain. But for those of you that are familiar, host disabled, participant sharing screen. Rebecca Linzer, are you here? Okay, so it looks like Matan Hasharon has not allowed me to share the screen. Rebecca, are you here? Working on it. Okay, she's working on it. Okay, let me know as soon as it's So one of the things that I've spoken about in lots of my other classes, and we're going to be talking about today, and again, for those of you that have seen this handout before, I really do apologize, but just in case. One of the things we're going to be talking about when we learn Ezra Nehemiah is sort of to be able to distinguish between history and historiography. Here, someone is putting it up. Hold on 1 second. Yeah, there we go. Can everyone see it? Just someone nod your head if you got it, if it's up there. Yeah? Okay.
Got it.
All right, excellent. So instead of me trying to paraphrase what Mayor Sternberg says much more eloquently than me, we're going to read inside the difference between the two approaches, because one of the things we're going to be really looking at is Ezra Nehemiah, not just for the strict history that we're able to learn from it, but also how biblical authors use history as a sort of vehicle through which concepts are articulated. So here, this is, and again, it's from The Poetics of Biblical Narrative, if anyone is interested in buying the book. Source-oriented inquiry addresses itself to the biblical world as it really was, usually to some specific dimension thereof. The theologian, qua-theologian, dreams of piecing together a full picture of ancient Israelite religions, mutations and conflicts included. The historian wants to know what happened in Israelite history. The linguist, what the language system, phonology, grammar, semantics underlying the Bible was like. And the geneticist concentrates on the real-life processes that generated and shaped the biblical text, the origins and the features of the materials, meaning documents and traditions that went into the Bible, the passage from oral to written transmission, the identity of the writers or schools, the modes, that's a typo, my apologies, of editorial work, the tampering by way of interpolation, scribal misadventure, etc. In each case, then, interest focuses on some object behind the text, on a state of affairs or developments which operated at the time as source, material, antecedent, enabling condition of biblical writing, and which biblical writing now reflects in turn. Discourse-oriented analysis, which is what we're going to be doing, on the other hand, sets out to understand not the realities behind the text, but the text itself as a pattern of meaning and effect. What does this piece of language, metaphor, epigram, dialogue, tale, cycle, book signify in context? What are the rules governing the transaction between storyteller or poet or reader? Are the operative rules, for instance, those of prose or verse, parable or chronicle? And this is, again, this all seems sort of hypothetical, but when we look in Ezra Nehemiah, there's going to be lists and lists and lists of names, which is going to be so bizarre because really since Sefer Bamidbar, we don't have lists of names like that. Or there are going to be portions in Ezra Nehemiah where they're going to be quoting word for word an Aramaic document. So rather than just reading the Aramaic document, right, what we're going to want to understand is why is the author, instead of paraphrasing it into Hebrew, incorporating an Aramaic document smack in the middle of a sefer like that? Okay, are the operative rules, for instance, those of prose or verse, parable or chronicle, omniscience or realistic limitation, historical or fictional writing? What image of a world does the narrative project? Why does it unfold the action in this particular order and from this particular viewpoint? What is the part played by the omissions, redundancies, ambiguities, alternations between scene and summary, or elevated and colloquial language, which is all going to be important. We're going to see in Parak Aleph, there's going to be the, this is one of the first classes we're going to do inside the text. There's going to be the Cyrus cylinder quoted in Hebrew, and then in Parak Vav, they're going to quote the actual cylinder in the decree in Aramaic, and we're going to look at the differences between those. How does the work hang together, and in general, what relationship does part stand to whole and form to function? The thrust here remains determinate and stable under wide terminological, even conceptual variations. To pursue this line of questioning is to make sense of the discourse in terms of communication, always goal-directed on the speaker's part, and always requiring interpretive activity on the addressees. So we're the addressees, and what we're going to always be trying to look at and get back to is the question of what the author is communicating to me through that very conscious decision of how to phrase it or what style to utilize. In the framework of an implicit sociocultural code, the one wields certain linguistic and structural tools with an eye to certain effects. The other infers a coherent message from the signals, and the discourse mediates between the two, embodying intent and guiding response. Okay, so we're going to be, we're going to be looking really at the second of the two approaches. We're going to be looking at this discourse-oriented approach. Now, I'm going to leave questions. I'm going to leave time for questions in just about 2 minutes, but I wanted to finish with one other point. That's important for us to remember when we're discussing this topic. And actually, someone just mentioned it, so it's sort of like leads us into this. And that's the concept that return, right, or Israel's bonds with the land was conceived of as a return. And this, you know, you asked before about exile, but there was always the implication of return. And I would say go back even, the concept of return even exists before exile, okay? What do I mean by that? I mean that if we look just by way of example, and here you go, because now we're going to be reading this parsha in 2 weeks, so it's perfect. Just go to the very beginning of Bereshit, okay, where the topic of land is discussed at all, right? For the very first time we see, right, up until Perek Yud Aleph, essentially in Tanakh, it's really all those sort of primordial stories. You have the flood, and you have the creation, and you have the Tower of Babel, and we have all the stories that talk about humanity wholesale, and all the truths that hold true for humanity, okay? And then in Perek Yud Bet, we meet Avram Avinu. For the very first time, Tanakh now narrows to the focus on us, to the focus on Israel specifically, and not just the nation, or not the entirety of the world. And so if you look, for example, in Perek Yud Bet, in Bereshit, it says, Vayomer Hashem el Avram, right, the famous psukim we're all familiar with. Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladecha u'mibeit avicha el haaretz asher areka, right? So on the surface, the command doesn't seem to imply that Avram is returning to the land, right? On the surface, it looks like Avram is leaving the land that he came from, and he's now going to this new place, okay? But when we look at Tanakh, there's a broader context that lies behind these psukim that we're looking at in isolation, right? There's lots of poetic psukim in Tanakh that reflect the idea that the land was divinely promised to us. Well, look, for example, one of the I think most profound psukim that really requires much more than a quick glance. But everyone skip just quickly to Devarim for 1 second. Perek Lamed Bet. Okay, this is in the very end, those final beautiful songs and poetry that again sort of really need much more time to discuss. But just look in Perek Zayin, in verse 7 in chapter 32. Okay, it says, Zechor yemot olam binu shnot dor vador she'al avicha v'yagedcha zekenecha v'yomer lach. It's saying sort of, ask about the past, ask how this all works, and here's what they're going to tell you. Here's what the elders, the wise, the people that know will tell you. What are they going to say? V'hanachel el yon goyim v'hafrido b'nei adam. Right? When God initially gave nations their homes, meaning when God created the world, God is in control of everything. He created the world and he created different places throughout the land, throughout the world. And for each nation, there was a specific land. Yatsev gvulot amim limispar b'nei Yisrael. Right? So he's saying he sort of set all the divisions. Hashem fixed the boundaries. And it says, Ki chelek Hashem amo Yaakov chevel nachlato. And then it really goes on in this beautiful poetry to describe how from the beginning, right, this specific little piece of land was meant to be ours. It was designated for us, for Hashem's people. Okay, so again, we're reading as Abraham is leaving his land and going to this land that he doesn't recognize, but as students of Tanakh, as readers of Tanakh, as people who have read Tanakh from beginning to end, we know that as much as that's sort of a novel voyage for Abraham, it's really, metaphysically speaking, a return, because that's where he and his descendants were always meant to be, okay? Now, again, by the way, in Egypt also, in Mitzrayim, there's a similar concept. When Hashem says, here we can even go inside the psukim very quickly, in Bereshit Perek Tet Vav, okay, the Brit Bein HaBetarim. Go to Bereshit, Genesis chapter 15, okay, the famous covenant that Hashem makes with Avram Avinu. And in Perek Yud Gimel, in verse 13, it says, Vayomer Lavram, Yadoa Teda Ki Ger Yezaracha Be'eretz Lo Lahem Va'avadum Ve'inu Otam Arba Me'ot Shana. Right, so he's saying you have to go to this land, and they're gonna, and it's gonna be really hard. They're gonna be enslaved for 400 years. V'gam Nefagoy Asher Yavodu Dan Anochi V'acharechen Yitzu B'Irchush Gadol. Etc., etc. The Brit Bein HaBetarim, okay, nowhere in there is it presented as retribution for the sins, right? Later on in Yecheskel, we're going to see that's going to come into. When Hashem makes a promise to Abram, it's very, very simple. There's going to be movement out, and then there's going to be movement back, movement out, and movement back. And the what we call exile, right, is just reported matter of factly. Right? There's no recriminations, there's no condemnation, there's no criticizing them. It's just a sense that this cycle of exile, diaspora, return is this archetype This pattern that Tanakh seems to be implying was always going to determine Israel's future progress in history. Okay, I'll give you one other pasuk to look like, and then I'm gonna leave time for questions. But if you just go, for example, to Dvarim very quickly, Parak Chet, it's Deuteronomy 28. Okay, here we see just how deeply ingrained the cycle is sort of in our, if you want to call it consciousness, or in our way of envisioning how history plays out. It's this constant back and forth. Verse 68, right? It says, you know what, I'll even jump back a few psukim. Let's start with verse 64, okay? Samach Dalet. Ve'hatitzcha Hashem b'chol ha'amim miktzeh ha'aretz v'ad ktzeh ha'aretz v'avadet Hashem Elohim achirim asher lo yadata ata ve'avotecha eitz va'aven. Right, and we could call that, you know, in modern terminology, we could say that's sort of, you know, integrating too fully into the native land. Uvagoyim ha'hem lo targia v'lo yihya manoach l'chaf raglecha v'natan Hashem lecha sham lev ragaz v'chil yoni naim za'avon nafesh. And there it's going to be hard and it's going to be painful and you're going to become despondent. But verse 66, v'hayu chayecha tzlu'im lecha mineged ufachadeta layla v'yomam v'lo ta'amin v'chayecha. Right, you're going to be terrified. There's going to be pogroms. There's going to be horrible realities in that foreign land. Boker tomar mi tain erev, uva erev tomar mi tain boker. Mi pachad levavcha asher tifchad umimar'eh inecha asher ter'eh. You will never feel at peace. The hatred will always be hovering. V'heshivcha Hashem mitzrayim ba'aniyot b'derech asher amarti lecha lo tosif od lirota. V'yitmakartem sham lo'ovecha l'avadim l'shvachot ein koneh. Right, he's saying, and you're going to be sent back to Egypt, and all those things are going to happen. But ultimately, and again, I'm gonna skip to the end, the concept, right? Ultimately, the rest of the parak is really dealing with the concept of returning, because parak lamed jumps There's a concept that exile is a constant, a reality in our history, but exile is really just the step before return. Okay, and that constant cycle is something that's embedded in how our history plays out. So what we're going to be looking at really in Ezra Nehemiah is how the first returnees, Ezra Nehemiah, it is going to be unprecedented. It's going to be the first time Jews are returning to the land after they had been in exile. Okay, and they're going to have to rebuild, but there's still going to be a diaspora community. And so how they deal with that reality and how they talk about the diaspora community and how they talk about Israel as the center or as one of the centers is really going to inform in so many more ways than I think we imagine how diaspora from then on in and how return from then on in was understood throughout Jewish history. So we're going to be looking at all of those concepts. I'm just going to open you guys up now because I want to leave time. I want to make sure people know that there's time at the end for questions.
Where did you just read from? Can you just repeat?
That was
what?
Dvarim Chet.
Okay.
Chet or Chet? Yeah, Chet 28.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, because I was getting a couple of messages, the ones that I was able to catch before they went off my screen, that I think people prefer questions held till the end. So we're gonna, I guess, reinforce that that rule for now. But you know, rest assured, I will always leave lots of time at the end because I know that people have questions and these are new concepts, and I want people to feel comfortable asking. So, opening up the floor, go for it, ladies.
I have a question. I have a question. When you're talking about what we're doing with Ezra and Nehemiah it's the first time that the Jews are returning to their land after being exiled, but that's not really true because they returned to Eretz Yisrael from Mitzrayim.
Yeah, but they were coming in for the first time as the nation, and they had to first conquer the land and call it theirs, right? We claimed that it was our land, but the Canaanites did not. So it wasn't a return to the land where they once had sovereign. It was going back to the land that was conceptually theirs, that they had to then make their own. Right? This is the first time where we lived.
But I mean, Abraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov, their whole clan there, they lived in Eretz Yisrael, and then they went down to Egypt because there was a famine and they couldn't support themselves.
Right, listen, it's not the, meaning when I say, I'll say it's the first return of its kind. Okay, certainly the descendants of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov went back, but they just become a nation in the desert, and they were going into the land as a nation for the first time. They didn't go out as a national group and return as a national group. Okay, if that makes more sense.
Okay.
Other questions?
I have a question.
Sure. Wait, I can't see you. Take your video.
Yeah, here I am. I have a question regarding the difference between discourse-oriented analysis and source-oriented analysis. And you said we're doing discourse-oriented analysis. And
for the most part, I mean, if we look at, what I'm meaning to say is that we're not looking at Ezra Nehemiah to say, let's figure out exactly what happened. And we're not looking at Ezra Nehemiah to say, let's see which, Persian documents influence the way that what we're looking at, what we're trying to understand, and what I think is really important to always try to understand when we learn Tanakh is, what is the author trying to convey through the way that he is writing, through the documents that he's including and through the ones he's leaving out, through the specific language that he's using, through the specific style that he's adopting, all of those things. So rather than looking at the text and saying, this is what I now know about this window in history, what we're saying is, this is what I now understand about what the author wanted me to learn from this window in history, how the author perceived the events, how the author perceived reactions, how the author perceived lessons we have to learn from it, and how his telling of history, or that window in history, communicates those ideas. That's sort of more what we want to look at. Right? It's not just taking the facts at face value, but why are those facts in particular being presented to me in this specific way?
it's more analytical than factual.
Yeah, certainly.
Thank you.
All right, other questions? That's it? No questions? I left so much time, guys.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi,
Yes.
Shoshana.
So, wait, I can't see you. Hold on. Where are you?
I purposely put on my video.
Oh, hi, Shoshana. Yes.
So based on this hypothesis, you think that there is this back and forth dynamic, but that was put in place even from the Ben Abatarim. But would you say that the ideal was that the Korban was supposed to happen and that we were supposed to go into exile, or ideally we should have actually just stayed had we not made so many mistakes?
So I'll say it like this, and it might be right? It might be sort of too simple. I think that what we learned from the covenantal concept, right, which is that, here are the rules, and if you could, the bracha v'klala, right, if you could keep the rules and remain in the land. I would say that I think what the back and forth is always reminding us of is that our existence on the land is not a given. It's something that we earn by behaving the way that God expects us, his people that he chose to live here, to behave. And that demands certain things of us, and it demands certain behaviors and certain moral, bars that we have to meet. And so, are we, in theory, right, if we could talk about the ideally we should always be here, right? But we earn our place to be here. So if we could consistently, eternally earn our place to be here, great. Right, but in Tanakh, there's always sort of this implied understanding that humanity has shortcomings and humanity has flaws, and that there's going to be sin and reward, and that there's sin and punishment and reward, and right. So I think there's sort of this. When I talk about it as a cycle, I think there's actually something comforting about it, right? It's sort of that the return is always there; it's always a possibility, and ultimately we're the ones that determine it. Right, which is both empowering and also terrifying. I think, I don't know if that answer your question. I don't know if it did.
Yeah.
Okay. I think it's very much tied into the covenant. I think that's it. So yeah, in theory, it would be great if we could stay, but we're the ones that decide that reality. We're the ones that determine it. But never locked, right? It's not like Gan Eden, the tree of knowledge, that's locked and we can never get back. The possibility for return is always looming, just like I'll say it like this: when we're outside, the possibility for return is always there, and when we're inside, the possibility for exile is always there. So you're always careful. You never get too complacent, and that's important.
How is it that we can return? Because there are so many mitzvot and so many things we can't do when we're in exile, which are the rules of the covenant that we cannot respect. So if we
No,
have a
so
right
you don't get kicked out of the land for not doing, mitzvot tatzliot ba'aretz. You get kicked out of the land when you're murdering people, when you're worshiping foreign god. You get kicked out of the land for abominations.
Yeah, but I'm talking about having the right to come back. I mean, how do we earn the right to come back? Right to come back, because
hold that question, because the Nevi'im address it in the beginning. One of the things we're going to be talking about in the beginning of the course is how the right to come back sort of evolved. Do we think of it religiously as we earned it? Do we think of it as historical contingencies that now there's a great leader? Hold that question. That's important, and how we answer that is going to play into how we see history as well. It's an excellent question.
It's a hard question.
And spoiler alert, no two voices in Tanakh are going to agree, right, on an answer. And that's important. So we look at all of them. All right. Any other questions? No? Quiet? Silence? All right. So then I will work better on my timing. I didn't realize, okay, I wanted to make sure to leave plenty of time so no one felt cut off. Oh, wait, I see a hand. Yeah. Wait, Chana, take your mute off. Wait, I can't hear you. Wait, someone's trying. Chana, you're trying to talk, but you're on mute, so just unmute yourself. Nope, now you're muted. No. Okay, type it in. All right. We will
check the chat.
That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do that before I leave. I'm going to check the chat before I leave. And we'll work on
some questions there.
What we're going to do is we'll balance the leaving most comments. I would say if there's a burning question to either type it in or just, if it's a quick question asked, but I think there's been a request for most comments to sort of be held until the end. So I really want to leave time at the end because I appreciate the comments. I want to hear them. And we'll gauge the timing better also. And that's it. We will reconvene next week.
Yael, I have one comment to make.
Yeah, please.
You mentioned that the return is solely dependent on us. But if you look at Ha'azinu and you look at the first return during the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, it was predetermined. They were saying after 70 years, you will be allowed to come back. And in Ha'azinu, there's no talk of tshuva. It's Hashem initiating the return.
Correct. So again, I'm just trying to think about, I'm going to ask you to hold it also, because those two questions of why we return and how the return manifests are both things that we're going to be dealing with in the beginning. So I don't want to answer it al regel achat. But if I don't answer it in the next, I would say 3-4 weeks when we actually first go into Chagai Zachariah's prophecies, then scream at me and I'll address it more specifically, but hold it because it's a really important question. Right? Are we in control? Is time in control? Are foreign leaders in control? Who holds right? Who's pulling the strings? That's important. All right, ladies, we will see you back next week, hopefully. Have a great week. Stay safe, wear your masks, social distance.
The chats. You're going to look at the chats.
You want me to do that
questions
now?
in the
That's
chats.
actually brilliant. Okay, hold on. Hi, Rebecca. One second. Okay. My background. Someone asked for my background. Okay, hold on. Let me just see if there's any more. I'll give it to you in a second. Let me just hear. Oh, hi. Okay. I'm skipping through choppy connection. Was my connection choppy? Okay.
No.
Okay. We saw this wish for cohesiveness and community with the expulsion of Gush Katif. Yes, right, exactly. And the question will be, right, because there's no question they felt forced. The question will be what happens in the next generation or two. Do they hold on? That's fascinating and timely. Okay, the sources were posed. Okay. Oh, thank you. Someone likes my makeup. Okay. Okay, to return to her Kohelet, here, okay, so someone's asking to return to the Kohelet format, questions and comments only at the end. Okay, so we're gonna stick with that. Okay, here, Gila, flora and fauna are native to certain lands. I posit it is also true for human beings, in particular Jews in Israel. One of the advantages of exile is the idea of bringing the treasures with us when we return, as in Egypt. The treasures remain and come with us, the junk stays behind. That's interesting. That's really, really interesting. Okay. Lech Lecha. It's the experience of the first ger, i.e. Avram and Sarah, and creates the space to connect to God as the primary connection. God provides the place for this to happen, right, and shows them the promise. Exile, which follows, steals and creates gratitude and national memory regarding the difference between things. So I like that a lot. Okay, the handouts were there. Okay, I'm just checking if there are any other pressing questions in the comments. To make the text larger, you got it. Okay. As this is an important question. Ezra and Nehemiah were Nevi'im, right? No, Ezra and Nehemiah were not Nevi'im. That's an important question that we're going to address. Haggai and Zechariah were Nevi'im that were giving Nebuah in the early phases of the return movement. Ezra and Nehemiah, Ezra was a Sofer and he was a Kohen, and Nehemiah was really, for all intents and purposes, just a political leader. They were not Nevi'im. That's important, and that's also why they're in Ketuvim and not Nevi'im. Okay. No, the sources I mentioned are not. If people prefer, I could start just making a list of the sources. If someone, exile prophesied in Brit Bein HaBetzarim was not cast as conditional based on our behavior. Correct. That's exactly the point. That it's just sort of built into the process. Okay. Yes, for next week, I will list the sources. So that anyone who wants, if I reference a source and I say it too quickly or your internet chops out on you, you can always go back to the sheets. I will use that in the share screen. And please, by all means, I think it'll make it easier. I think it'll make it easier for people if they print out the sources ahead and then they could look at which sources I'm going through. I'll do them in order as I'm using them, and that way people aren't overwhelmed. Abby,
any prep work for next week?
No, I don't give homework. Come on.
No, preparation, not homework.
No, so I would say once we start, I will definitely say actually, once we start reading inside, because Ezra Nehemiah is so, is less familiar than some of the other Sarim, I would definitely suggest keeping one parak or two ahead, but we're not going to be delving into Ezra Nehemiah yet. We still have two more sort of introductory classes where I'm going to be talking about the history and the timeline and all that stuff. So, but once we start going into it, definitely read a parak ahead, just so when I reference things, you're more familiar with it. You don't feel lost.
Yeah, and
yeah.
Would you mind also listing the sources that you referred to today so that we can have them in front of us as well?
Sure. I can send them. You know what? I can send them through the office. I'll email them to the office right now. They could forward them. Okay. Okay. Anything else?
Thank you very much.
Right. Have a wonderful week and enjoy.
Yael, you didn't give your background.
Oh, who asked for that? Who's there?
Somebody asked for it on the chat, but I'm reminding you that you didn't answer it.
My background. Who asked? Oh, Abby. Wait,
Yeah.
Are you Karen's mother-in-law?
I am.
Oh, well, then I have to give you my background. I went to college with Karen.
You get 10 points for that.
There you go. Now you have to stay in the class. We made Aliyah. It was 6 years in the summer. Before that, I was teaching at Stern for 7 years. I taught Tanakh there for 7 years. Before that, I taught in Ramaz High School for also 6 or 7 years. I did my master's in Jewish studies at Columbia while I was teaching at Ramaz. A history degree at Stern. We live in Modena.
Where are you from?
Oceanside originally.
Where?
Oceanside, New York, right by the beach.
I'm from Brooklyn. We never went to Queens.
I was born in Brooklyn.
Another 10 points.
And my father still works there, actually. So he's braving Brooklyn even in Corona.
I'll tell Karen I met you.
Please do. Send her my love.
I will.
All right. Have a great day, guys. Shavua Tov.
Thank you. Shavua Tov.
Wonderful week.
Thank you.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov. Shavua Tov.
Chodesh Tov. Shavua Tov. Bye-bye.